Welcome, everybody. I'm Jerry Friedman, a co-chair of Elders Climate Action, and I want to welcome you to our national call for the month of June, a couple of days after the summer solstice. Hope you're all doing well. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, I'm going to tell you how to do that. We have a really great guest speaker tonight, Emma Ruby-Sachs, and you'll be hearing from her in a couple of minutes. First, I just want to let you know, for those of you who've not been here before, if you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's several icons. There's a chat where you can go and introduce yourself and say where you live, if you like. And then also there's a Q&A box. There'll be time for question and answers at the end. So please put your questions in there, and we'll be able to get them answered at the end of this call. We're really excited to continue our national calls. They've been so successful. We've gotten such good feedback from them. So, and I know you're going to enjoy tonight's call also. You will also be receiving a recording of the call tomorrow, so you'll be able to watch it again at your leisure. But now I'd like to introduce you to Myra Jackson, who is an Elders Climate Action volunteer and is working hard on our education committee to really bring to you some of the best information and speakers that we can. And Myra's going to introduce you to our speaker for tonight, Emma Ruby-Sachs. So over to you, Myra.
Thanks, Jerry, and hello, everyone. Listen, I am not going to take much time because we want every minute we can with Emma. I am excited to have her, and I know that you have that bio in front of you, and I don't want to repeat that, but I do want to pull out something just in case you're interested in what I have found interesting, and that is her authorship of the book, The Waterman's Daughter. She did this before she was 30 years old. You must read it. It's fiction, and I have pleaded with her to not stop writing. But here's the reason why I felt that she would be great for our national call. On May 13th, Emma was on a global call with planetary emergency partners. And we were in that call, and in 5 minutes, we didn't give her much time, she laid out tactics and strategies that were complex, easy to understand, concise, and action-oriented. And I felt that to have her on our call would add great value. And so this executive director of SumOfUs, who has members of 15 million, can you believe that? 15 million members out there pressing on corporate interests and on many, many fronts, is here with us tonight. So I'd love for you to give her your full attention, and let's get everything we can out of her to help aid us in taking action. It's all yours, Emma. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you both so much. That is such a generous introduction, and I am so excited to be here and talking to you guys tonight. I'm sitting in Toronto in Canada, which is where I grew up, and I crossed the border to see my parents for the first time in a long time. And it is, my home is really in Chicago, and it's been an amazing time to take on this new job. So a little bit of background about me: I was trained as a lawyer, and I worked as a lawyer for a number of years. And then I took a crazy job with an organization called Avaz, which is a global campaigning organization that has, we grew, when I joined it was just a few million people, but it grew quite rapidly, and it's done a lot of work in the climate activism space. And after a decade there, I took some time off to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and have just taken over this role as the executive director of SumOfUs. And what I love about the organization that I've just started working with is that we have a really amazing group of members who not only take action by signing petitions and sending messages and being active on social media, but they do a lot of deep work talking to media themselves, filing proxy filings and shareholder activism. So there's a very deep community network there that I really love. And our mission is really about making sure that human beings are at the center of corporate regulation and corporate practices. So sometimes we're the shareholders, sometimes we're the consumers, sometimes we're the employees, but it's about creating that sense of accountability, that when you have a corporate structure that's geared towards profit, that the human element really is at the center of their actions and the regulations in their field, which means that we get to do a lot of work around climate. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an example of how we do what we do, because sometimes I feel like campaigning, especially online first campaigning, is a bit of a black box and nobody gets what the point of it is, or they get a bunch of emails but they're not quite sure what happens after you sign an email. But this model is what I think of as a highly accountable model. It's where you have a very broad-based group of people from all over the world, and not only are they the members of the organization, but they do the majority of the funding. So at SumOfUs, small online donations are the vast majority, close to, at this point, over 90% of the entire operating budget. And you don't run campaigns unless your members agree to run them. So through a series of testing and polls, you make sure that the same people who make up the membership, both donors and non-donors, get to decide what you campaign on. And then you might see an email in your inbox asking you to sign a petition or send a message. But there's a campaigns team behind that email that scurries around and creates other levers of influence. So one example from Canada, which I've been thinking about because here I am in my home country, is there's a dollar store chain called Dollarama, which is one of the main employers of people of color in the country. And one of the main employers, actually, for some small towns, as in the United States, it's sort of your grocery store, and also your employer. It's plays a huge role in the community. I'm seeing a little notice in the chat about sound. Can you guys still hear me? Okay. Then I'll leave you to help Kathy find how to fix the sound. So what we realized was that they were not giving proper PPE to their employees. And there were no masks, there were no gloves, there wasn't really much hazard pay, which was something that the Canadian corporations were doing on a regular basis. And so we mobilized our members to communicate their fear on behalf of these most vulnerable workers across the country. But we also mobilized media to report on the story. We had a set of member investigators and staff investigators who biked all around taking pictures of the way people were being treated at Dollarama. We took out ads in newspapers. We had Dollarama employees show up at an action. And through that series of sort of coalescing levers and influence points, we were able to shift Dollarama, not completely, but to increase PPE, to make sure that they were getting plexiglass up, and to make sure that there was hazard pay. And that's an example of how we do things. Sometimes it's not just straight campaigning. One of the things I'm really proud of most recently is where we created the first global mutual assistance network. So we had over 200,000 people active on a network where you could either offer help or ask to receive help. And it was an amazing cross-cultural exchange. Some people just teaching lessons to each other's children, language lessons, but also there were lots of requests for economic assistance. And our community raised tens of thousands of dollars through the SumOfUs webpage that then SumOfUs staff distributed out to SumOfUs members who were in need. And so it is a very real community in that way, and has a lot of depth and connection, especially in this time of crisis. So these are just some of the highlights of what I've gotten to experience just in the last few months, but it has been kind of a crazy few months to take a new job, just to be fair. We had, I think our first staff retreat was in Puerto Rico, supposed to be in Puerto Rico, right at the eye of the earthquake zone that was happening there. So we had to move that, and then we had coronavirus, and then it's been a very tough time across the country with just sort of hopefully a different kind of wrangling with systematic racism. And all of that has come to a head at the same time. But we haven't taken our focus off of climate. And that's been something that we, if you think about any of the things you want to achieve in the world, I think you guys all understand this, But when we're a multi-issue organization, we're constantly refocusing on the fact that securing our climate future and the principles of climate justice, that they are guiding principles for how we survive and how we grow and how we thrive as a people. And so they have been a big focus of ours. One of the things we've been thinking about in reaction to what's happening in this moment in our history is that we're facing one of the largest opportunities to reimagine how our economies work that we've ever seen. And if you think about sort of the Green New Deal, the New Deal post the Depression, we're in an even bigger reckoning moment. It's global, and it's looking like it might even be more severe. I think the unemployment numbers already are in the U.S. And we're seeing trillions of dollars get reinvested in our economies. How those trillions of dollars get reinvested is really important. And there was a flurry of activity right now that came from governments that felt very urgent and emergent and wasn't always the smartest way of reinvesting that money. But what the economists are telling us is that we've got a few years of this where there's going to be large injections of capital and reworking the way that our markets operate. And we have a chance to fight for those to be climate forward reinjections. One example of a campaign we're working on right now is out of the European Central Bank. And they are, in this moment, having a bunch of consultative meetings. They have their big meeting in mid-July about how they want to do their next round and their biggest round of coronavirus recovery. And they have this proposal where they're going to be investing in companies like Shell and Total, but they are also governed by the European Union's climate objectives. And those two things don't meet. And so there is a public comment and a set of polls that we're running and a bunch of campaigns and a few advocacy meetings that this planetary emergency group that Myra and I were both on the call for helping us with, to make sure that the ECB is accountable to people, not to these industries. As you guys have seen, and we saw in the US, when an economic crisis hits, these companies go to the government and explain why they're too big to fail, and then they get large amounts of cash in return, but they don't necessarily deliver on the promises that they're making. And so this is, I think, a really exciting campaign where Europe can set almost like a best practice for global lending institutions about how we can change our economies and shift our economies, not only to a more sustainable level, but to rapidly shift us off of some of the most harmful investments, using this coronavirus, which is incredibly painful, but also as an opportunity to do this properly. So that is one moment that I'm really excited about. Another thing that's happening in the world are certain industries are facing a bit of a reckoning. We're a little bit, one of our foci are airlines and the airline industry. And if you're looking at all of the emissions around the world and what are contributing most to climate change, there's a few surprise guests in that list. One of them is refrigeration, is just a huge contributor. And another one is our airlines. And what's most interesting about both of those sectors is that they're covered by something called the Montreal Protocol. And that means that the Paris Climate Agreement, it has no effect on them. And they live in a little exempt world, off in a corner. And nobody's ever tried to regulate them, really. They have this meeting that nobody attends. Even big climate groups kind of ignore it. And it's hard to shift those meetings. They're considered technocratic meetings. And they've done a very good job of keeping people out of the conversation. But it's no longer acceptable for the airline industry to be lagging so far behind in climate emissions. And you're seeing countries, as the airlines being hit, one of the hardest hit industries, going to governments and saying we need bailout help. One of the other interesting studies about airlines has shown that bailing out an airline leads to the least amount of positive profit for the country, for the GDP itself. That they don't actually, their investments don't give a lot of returns to the population. And so they're under a lot of pressure right now. And France, for example, has said to Air France, sure, we'll bail you out. But we require you to hit these different climate emissions. So they're almost going around the Montreal Protocol and creating climate standards within the bailout agreements. And Air Austria has done the same thing. If you look at Lufthansa, they're succumbing to government ownership, which then will allow for there to be regulatory enforcement outside of the Montreal Protocol for years and years and years into the future. And it's just based on it's based on this basic premise that we shouldn't be bailing you out with public dollars if you're not going to be achieving a public good. So we want a stake in your company, or we want to make sure that you're following important public regulations as you rebuild and reimagine yourself in a post-COVID future. So that's another really exciting area, I think, for influence in this moment. And those airline bailouts, the first rounds have started coming through, but you'll start to see a lot of airlines fold. And as there's a consolidation in the market, they'll be coming back for another round of bailouts and then another opportunity to create these kind of incentives. And as these corporations fail to live up to their standards, so I think, I'm trying to remember which American airline got a huge bailout and is already starting to fire all their employees anyways. Now I'm blanking on it. I want to say Continental, but that doesn't exist anymore, does it? Anyway, but you're seeing these airlines take huge amounts of money and then fail to live up to even the basic standards that they promised, obviously verbal. And so that gives us another opportunity to create contractual obligations, to not make the mistakes that we did in the big bank bailout after the last financial crisis. So we're doing some campaigning, a lot of campaigning around airlines as well. And hopefully this can be not only a time where we see a shift in investment, but where we see a shift in the ways that governments regulate, that we don't have to leave this just to one agreement or one protocol or a group of technocrats, but that this is a public process that we need to be thinking of holistically and integrating all of our public policies into these kind of reaction moments. I did, one of the things I am spending a lot of time working on right now, partly because of my own personal obsession, is our credit rating agencies. And we all know about them because of their role in the financial collapse, the way that they were grouping assets because before the housing collapse, grouping assets and then giving them kind of like, oh, most of this looks fine, and then giving them a bit of a higher rating, and then that caused there to be this kind of house of cards under the investment world. Well, it turns out that they're doing that for climate too, and that they're essentially not taking into account the climate risks of certain investments, especially when that investment would change something from the lowest grade to what they call a junk rating, where nobody wants to invest in it. So they're loath, because their clients are the businesses, they're not the public, and they don't want to piss off the clients. So instead what they do is they take these things that have a lot of climate risk and they say, well, we're going to give you a low rating, but since it's climate, we get to fudge it. There's no science here. We just get to make it up as we go along, and we don't want to move you to junk, so we'll just let you hover along here. Really terrible stuff that nobody should be investing in because it's dirty coal that's got no future. And so they're playing a huge role, and there's a group called Sunrise that is about to release, I think in the next week or two, a report really detailing just how overrated all of these investments are, just how inaccurate this is, and drawing parallels between what happened with the housing market and what's about to happen with the energy and other investments because of this climate risk. Interestingly, these same credit rating agencies are playing a little game of cat and mouse with a bunch of international lending institutions where they're like, we know you need to forgive a bunch of debt because of coronavirus for the global south. And this is just for context, the Jubilee movement has been saying for a very long time that for any of the global south countries to reach these climate goals, they need to have debt forgiveness. They need, in order to preserve the parts of the earth we need to preserve, because there really is this understanding that if we don't preserve 50% of the planet, we can't reach any of these climate goals. For the global south countries to do this, they need capital. They don't have it because they're saddled with huge amounts of debt, many of which is of questionable origin and morality. So because of coronavirus, a lot of these international lending institutions are saying, oh, we should start forgiving some of this debt so that these governments have some time to respond to, some cash to respond to this public health crisis. And the credit rating agencies are like, well, we think that that's okay if you're a big international institution and you've diversified your portfolio. But if you're a small international lending institution, we might downgrade you, which then means that these public policy considerations of how we deal with debt are being influenced by these four little agencies that shouldn't have any of this outsized power and frankly already should be some of the most hated actors in the economic system. So I am having a little bit of an obsession, and we are going to be campaigning on the rating agencies in general and talking about the fact that they really perform a public function. And if you perform a public function in this way, you cannot be beholden only to private interests. We have to start looking at what they're doing and seeing how powerful they are, and especially talking about their role in promoting investment activities that don't achieve climate goals. So those are my climate and campaign obsessions right now. I did promise to talk a little bit about what I think that all of us can do to get involved in what's happening. And I wanted to focus a little bit on pension funds. And that's not just because this is the Climate Elders Call, although that is part of, we all, especially in the global north, we all have at least usually some relationship with a pension fund or know somebody who does. But pension funds are emerging as a really interesting lever to pull. And a lot of times what happens is, for us, we find a member who has a pension fund who invests in a corporation, and then that member becomes almost like a one-person activist stronghold, because that gives them enough power to go through the process to pose really hard-hitting questions at CEOs and eventually to create shareholder proposals. What you see with shareholder proposals is that you don't have to win a shareholder proposal. You just got to show over time, AGM after AGM after AGM, so annual general meeting after annual general meeting, a growth in popularity for your proposal. And oftentimes at 35% of the vote, we see a corporation shift their tactics because they can start to see the winds of change. They are very, very worried about shareholder activism in general. Recent example of this is a conglomerate of pension funds in New York and California just sort of took over the Amazon AGM and did that bunch of hard-hitting questions about how Amazon was treating its workers, which was just a beautiful thing to see, and B, just incredibly important to add that chorus of voices, because when you start talking to shareholders, that's when you get kind of that C-suite attention from corporations, and they start to get really worried. So I am a big fan of being in touch with pension funds. They don't get contacted very much. That's the other thing to know. So sometimes just sending an email inquiring about the kinds of investments in a certain area, especially climate, can be incredibly powerful. And then you start to see, like CalPERS, for example, shifted towards a kind of climate focus in their investment. And you start to see some of these pension funds moving in that direction. There also are a lot of other opportunities. One of the things that I like about specifically corporate campaigning is that they're very susceptible to brand damage. And sometimes just participating when you see these actions where there's a Twitter action or a Facebook action or a petition, you can have very small numbers, sometimes just 10,000 people, which is not a huge amount of people in the grand scheme of things, can make a corporation really pay attention. And you start getting letters back from really high level people and start a negotiation process about whatever issue you're bringing to their attention. So if it's about, there was a whole one about corporations advertising on YouTube on climate disinformation videos, which is a very big problem. You're losing some of the electorate fight on climate because of this disinformation about climate that's out there. And all of these brands that you and we all use all the time are having their ads on these videos, which means the creators of those videos are making money, which incentivizes them to create more videos. Well, you can cut that off at the source by writing those, looking at those videos online. If you see a brand you recognize, writing a letter or tweeting out and saying, hey, did you know that your ad is being run on this video? And that is a kind of there's this guy, Judd Legum, who's doing this single-handedly on Twitter, as far as I can tell, where he just tweets at advertisers and says, hey, do you know that your ads are being used for this nefarious purpose? And then these big companies are moving their advertisements very quickly. So I think that's another really important way that people can get involved. And of course, joining us, we're in a moment of recalibrating a little bit about how we work as a team. So it's still new days for me, but we have an amazing campaigns team that's running incredible and powerful and impactful campaigns all over the world. And they give you an opportunity to get corporations to pull funding for terrible right-wing politicians who don't believe in any of these climate goals. And they give you opportunities to be part of conversations about racial justice And they give you opportunities to be part of some of these shareholder actions too. You'll get emails saying, hey, we're looking for someone who's part of this pension fund to file a proxy for us, and deepen your work there. And then it's really also about community connection. I think especially now when people, even though we are all more than ever experiencing something together as a world, we are all also deeply isolated. I know I feel that. And part of being an online community is that we get the chance to connect and deepen our connection, in part because this is what's available to us. And I think that's powerful in itself, that being part of communities like this one allows us to reinforce that idea that by working together, we actually can change the world. My father was really involved in the civil rights movement in the US. And when I was a kid and he was telling me all about it, I asked him, like, what was it like? What was it like being part of that planning committee and in a basement with Bob Moses? And he's like, Emma, it was just always four of us in a basement and nobody else showed up. That's what it felt like. It felt lonely all the time. And only in retrospect do people call it a movement. And I always remember that. And I think about how many ways a day I can try and fight that feeling so that we can keep going, so that our kids will look back on this and think it was a movement and ask us questions about how it was. And that's one of my big motivating factors. I have taken up enough of your time, I think. So if there are questions, I love answering questions. If there's anything you guys would like me to talk more about, please just pop it in. I think there's a Q&A here, so I can just sort of go through them if that's useful, but I don't know if you have a process as well, guys.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Emma. If you would like to go through the Q&A, that's fine, or I can. It's up to you. I'm happy
Sure.
for you to look at it and see, which questions are most relevant and how you could want to frame them. So
Yeah,
feel free.
great. I'll just go through them in order of ask. So can other people see these Q&As, or is it helpful for me to read them out loud? Maybe read them out loud? Yeah, okay. Is some of us focused on the ground transportation, cars, freight trucks, and emission standards, and then move towards all electric vehicles? We are in general, this is a huge deal, this idea of when's the right moment to pressure governments on regulation about cars and trucks, et cetera. And there's so much interesting stuff happening here. Like, the only working example of carbon sequestration, capture and sequestration, is these big transport trucks that actually do it. It's a very interesting thing happening in sort of the science world. But one of the things we look for are moments for impact. So when something is central to a conversation, we run a campaign on it, as opposed to campaigning on an issue every single week for a long period of time. We almost are like, you call in the cavalry, and we come running in like a pressure point. We call it a crisis-tunity is the word that the industry uses, crisis and opportunity put together. There is part of the ECB conversation, the European Central Bank, is a lot about cars, because Germany is incredibly powerful in that conversation, as is Poland. And both of them, especially Germany, the car industry plays a very large role. And so there are some campaigning inroads, including polling, being done about the appetite for shifting away from a car-centered transportation economy. But that's the only live campaign about cars that I know of right now. Next one, how has some of us been able to get a voice with the corporations? Do you buy stocks so you can participate in proxies and shareholder meetings? I hope we do one day, very soon. That's one of our thoughts about how we could grow stronger and bigger in the future, and we have a whole plan for it, but it hasn't been actioned yet. We got to build up our base a little bit before we get there, because it costs money to do that stuff. But we do a couple of things. We use, sometimes foundations will do it for us. Sometimes pension funds will do it for us. Sometimes individual members will do it for us, and that's how we get a voice with them. But we also write letters to corporations, and it's very interesting how quickly it gets their attention. They have whole departments that do nothing but monitor certain inboxes. And I know it feels like writing into the abyss, but you would be surprised how often those letters get answered. If anyone has a practice of writing corporations on, I know that in my family, whenever you have a complaint, we were always told to go write a letter about it. But you do get a lot of answers, and sometimes we'll mobilize members to all write about an issue at a certain time with a corporation, and that really gets their attention. And handwritten or personalized letters with personalized messages, that's the key. It's they are responsive to people because that's their business model. Does some of us lobby state and federal governments and regulators? We do. And I think that's hugely important. If you think about the way that campaigning against corporations work, you can get, sometimes by moving corporations, you open up the space for regulation. So you think about in the tech world and disinformation, for example, you got to move Facebook and Google to start doing stuff, and then you hope that regulation comes in the back end and starts to create a world where every platform has to follow certain rules and laws. But if you just do corporate campaigning and not regulators, you're just leaving a hole for some other worse corporation to come in and do it. So you can get Shell to stop drilling in the Arctic, but that doesn't mean somebody else isn't going to come drill in the Arctic, who's just less accountable and less worried about their brand and maybe smaller. So I think that government lobbying and regulation it's the final answer. It's what's essential. It's also the most accountable. And, you know, if you believe in democracy, which I do, even when the government's not behaving perfectly, I really believe in this idea that it's the right arm to be making these policy decisions and setting us up for success in the future. The next one is, what sources of climate data do you rely on to have the push behind your demands? It's not one source, although we do have a rule that it has to be reported on by a major newspaper in order to be considered legitimate. But there's a ton of science data out there, and I mean, there's a million NGOs that do nothing but that, including something called the Climate Briefing Service. And the other thing I found is just that even though there's this idea of disagreement about these things, if you look at the science, 99.9% of scientists all agree on most of these climate issues. Like, we're not dealing with complicated science here. We're dealing with complicated solutions and a complicated economic system. But the science is really obvious and not difficult. This is not about understanding quantum physics. It's highly measurable. And sometimes in the media, especially in the US media, it seems like it's more complicated than it is, and it seems like there's a disagreement. But if you look at the numbers behind it, almost all scientists basically agree on what's going on here. Maybe I misunderstood, but what did you say is bad about the Montreal Protocol? Are you aware of the work that's being done to reduce emissions from airlines happening in Europe particularly? The Montreal Protocol is just weak, I guess is what I would say. It doesn't have very strong climate standards. And that's, I think, what's bad about it. It's not that it shouldn't exist, it's just, it should be as strong as basically the Paris Agreement. You know, that's sort of our North Star. That's where we've all come together and said, okay, this is something all governments can agree on. It's got that stakeholder legitimacy. And the Montreal Protocol is way behind, and it shouldn't be, because it's also a multilateral process that's run basically exactly the same way. And so it's just a double standard for areas of climate emissions that are just hugely important in the larger picture of what's the climate pie, what's causing the biggest problems. And yeah, there's a lot of work being done in Europe. I'm sure there's a ton I'm missing and I don't know about. But I know there's been a lot of lobbying. I know that some of these bailouts I talked about with the Air France and other airlines, that they are starting to reduce emissions. They're reducing the number of flights. They're talking about proper carbon offsets as opposed to sort of fakey ones. Also, a lot of airplanes can take multiple kinds of fuel, but they don't, because it's cheaper just to use regular fuel. And so it's almost like our airplane technology is ahead of the will of the companies to use it. I think that there's some airplanes that can take 15% renewable fuel already, but the airlines aren't using it because it's more expensive. It's a small margin industry when you think about the way that airline travel has changed over time. It's sort of like, it's like being in the fast food business. Like you're making just a small amount of money off of every ticket sold. And so they're trying to cut cost any way they can, which makes sense as a corporation. It just doesn't work so well for human survival. Am I going too quickly through these, guys? You'll just stop me if it gets too fast, right? Or if somebody wants to interject. I'm looking at Jerry and Mara and Jen. COVID-19 is a double whammy of increased costs and reduced revenues. Boeing and the airlines are in serious trouble both now and long term. Should more attention be focused upstream to the manufacturers and not just the airlines themselves? How do we best choose who to focus on? And how can we be confident in government accountability over bailout funds when we are already not seeing this in the US? It's a good question. It's hugely complicated. What I would say in terms of the upstream focus is I think this is going to be demand-led. And so, yes, we want Boeing to be accountable and Bombardier, but it's once you regulate the industry, you hit both. So one of the things we hear sort of from people in the Air France world, for example, is like, hey guys, we're being regulated. We're now interested in everybody else being regulated just like us. Like, you've got to create a floor here. Otherwise, there's just going to be competitive advantage for whoever ignores this stuff. And so I think that's going to bring the manufacturers up to speed with the airlines. I don't think it's going to happen either way. And I'm just not sure this is a corporate-led process, especially because of the double whammy situation, that we're going to have to kick these guys when they're down because they are a huge problem in terms of emissions. And it's not that we want to see air travel fall apart, but it's like if there was a restaurant that was just barely paying their employees and then the minimum wage got raised to bare minimum levels like $15 an hour, and that meant the restaurant closed. You got to ask yourself if that restaurant should exist in the first place. And if you are an industry that's really treating their employees badly and refusing to be regulated and causing serious climate damage, then that industry needs to be reimagined. And if it falls apart, it may not be a terrible thing that it falls apart. And it doesn't mean that we'll never be able to fly again. It just means that one of the things that coronavirus has given us in airline industry and across the world is this opportunity to reimagine. And the pain is happening, and we may as well get something good out of the pain, because we're going to see airlines close no matter what. So let's see whatever survives be not only good employers and good experience for flyers, but actually sustainable for our future. Are there things that our members can do to help SumOfUs with some of its campaigns? Yes. Check your investments. That is incredibly important. If you know what your investments are and where you're investing, that would be just amazing for us. And we are always trying to map that. Also, if you are employed by any of the major corporations involved in any of this climate stuff, or any of the major tech organizations as well as another big one, or any major pharmaceutical corporation, that's also really important, because employees form a super powerful advocacy base for corporations. A lot of corporations now, employees are basically their biggest asset. And then they're starting to see their employees think, well, wait, I want a job, but I want a job I can believe in and feel good about. So those are another really important asset. And you can always reach out to me. My email address is Emma, EMMA, @sumofus.org, SUMOFUS. And I am very sorry the name is a math pun in English. I did not come up with it. It's a bit complicated. Oh, thank you, Jen. I know SumOfUs was involved in the Better Chicken campaign. Will SumOfUs be involved in the movement to eradicate factory farms? Oh, I'm so excited about what's happening in the meat world right now, because I think we're seeing this incredible moment with coronavirus. Weirdly, this is like, it's so horrific. I don't want to underplay the horrifyingness of coronavirus and how I'm living it every day and the lives lost, but also just the way it's laying bare everything. My wife talked to a friend of hers who's Baha'i, who said that for the Baha'i, the apocalypse is not the end of the world. It is the laying bare of the world around us. And it just feels very poignant for this moment. I might be misquoting that, so if anyone here is Baha'i, please forgive me, because I'm sure I just botched what is a very beautiful tradition. But I found it very poignant when I heard it. So what we're seeing with factory farming is really an exposure of how horrible the conditions are for people in these factory farms. You talk about an industry that shouldn't exist because it just can't afford to treat anyone like a human being. That's one of them. And then we're seeing a rise in affordable and wonderful opportunities to not use meat to produce food for the planet. And we're seeing also an understanding of how massive deforestation, mostly to serve meat, is causing a rise in these kind of diseases. So the whole conversation is coming together around coronavirus, and we're seeing much more regulation. So I am expecting this to be a big focus, and I'm pretty sure we're doing a big Germany-wide one right now on pig farming in Germany, which is a huge industry, and making sure that that's regulated to the point where hopefully it stops being such a large industry. And and starts moving down in our estimation. And I say this as somebody who eats meat. But and comes from a family, my sister tried to be vegetarian, and then my father just stopped feeding her for a while because he refused to accommodate a vegetarian kid in the house. But I'm a real believer in the idea that we're going to have to move as a world and as regulators on this, that it can't just be up to personal responsibility, although that's important. We really have to shift things, because at the end of the day, there's always going to be people for whom meat is the cheapest and most accessible option, and we want to make it so that cheap and accessible and healthful options are out there that aren't meat. And I think they're already starting to be. So I think this is exciting. There's a lot of movement on this, which is going to be amazing. And in the US too, we're seeing the outbreaks in the factory farms, I think, are bringing this conversation forward. What do you imagine for some of us in 2021? What is your dream? I love this question. I have this idea about some of us being much bigger than it is, and being an organization where we take on fewer campaigns, but when we take on a campaign, we talk about it from all angles. So you have policymakers who are drafting laws and regulation to solve the problem. You have a team of lawyers who are litigating to make sure that the ways in which public interests are not being served are dealt with in an immediate way. You have shareholders who are mobilizing to create proxy proposals to ensure that there's shifts inside the companies. You've got an employee organizing group that's using online communications to alert employees to what's happening and empowering them to take action from inside. You have consumers speaking out in ways that attack the brand of a corporation or of an entire industry. And you bring all these things together on one issue simultaneously, and that people just start to learn that when some of us is coming for you, you've got to watch out. And in that way, I think we can start to shift whole industries as opposed to just individual corporations. That's not 2021, because we're still small, but I think that that is where we are headed as an organization, and I'm excited about that future. And I think that that's going to be the kind of stories I'm going to be excited to tell about why we as people are powerful, that like we can work together and do things in very strategic ways and make shifts rapidly. We just have to pull all those levers simultaneously. We can't just do one. We've got to be multi-issue, but we also have to be able to operate in multiple realms. Looking back over its history, what would you say were the key bases for some of us enormous growth and strengths? I'm going to skip that question because I don't actually know the answer, being brand new. But I will hopefully answer that question in 5 years with some wonderful stories. Are you involved in pushing for transparency with the funds the US government is now dispersing? We are. It's very tough, but there is a campaign happening right now, and my memory is failing me. Hold on a second. It's like, you know, those ideas that are kind of slipping out of your brain. There is right now a campaign happening in the US about a certain, small business bailout funds, where there's been a bunch of exposure about the fact that it looks like some congressional members of Congress and their family members got these bailout funds, but then there was no transparency about where they were delivered. So it's just this really terrible appearance of corruption, and using that as a basis for ensuring transparency of all the funds. It's hard right now in the US, as you guys all probably know, to create movement on a regulatory level, but there's a lot of really rich conversation happening leading up to the election. And so sometimes we've been moving these ideas forward and these campaigns forward in the hopes that they become part of the larger story of what's happening in our democracy right now. And by doing that, motivating people to be out voting and to deal with all the voter suppression that's already happening and work to overcome it. Bill Murphy is recommending I get in touch with the group in the Bay Area about how moving to working from home is really actually going to help with these, with sort of climate impacts of corporations. And I think that's right. I work totally mobily anyways, so I'm not part of that world who had to transition, but I would definitely like to be in contact with them if there's a way that we can help. just so that listeners don't think that the Montreal Protocol was a bad thing, it was addressing the ozone and is a great example of how international treaty can be successful. Yes, sorry, I don't mean to say that it was a bad thing, and it was passed in 1987, which I think is partially why it's out of date. It is a really important treaty. I would, though, say that there is this risk right now with the Montreal Protocol where people think it's there and it's doing its job, and it's not. Even on the ozone work, it's not doing its job. And so we have to start involving ourselves in that process and being critical of it to make sure that it rises to the standards that we hope. In the same way that a lot of UN processes are like this, you know, it's like when people talk about all sorts of international processes that run out of the UN, the fact that it's happening is good, but that doesn't mean it's good enough in terms of the content. And you've got to keep upping the ambition. And I just feel like Montreal, for whatever reason, has had this little exemption card, and I don't really want to have it anymore for the Montreal Corporation. How can we get corporations to not be people? Oh, good question. There is a bunch of bad jurisprudence on this, and I don't know the answer to that, except that the only way I know how to undo jurisprudence is to change public opinion so significantly that the court starts to feel like they're going to be too out of step with the public to maintain its legitimacy, and they have to shift. It's the only way I know how to get it to overrule itself. And so I think that it's not just about changing justices. We have to actually clearly change the way the public sees corporate actors and have that be something that's heard loud and clear in order for the court to feel like it's necessary for them to overrule themselves, because even liberal judges don't like doing that. Do you collaborate with other organizations? If so, do they initiate campaigns, or do you? We do. We collaborate all the time, and our campaigns are pretty much always either suggested or collaborated on with an on-the-ground group. We're not great at deep involvement in communities. That's not our strength, because we're a big organization that kind of comes in at a key moment. So we rely on partners to help inform us on when's the right moment to get involved, how to get involved, and what does that look like. And so that's something that we are really careful of, because there's so much we don't know. It's just making sure that we're being strategic, and we have to kind of become mini experts, and you have to rely on the ground groups in order to do that. So that's some of our most valuable work or partnerships. And then also there's just issue specific groups that have been, so we're not a climate group only. And there's some groups that do climate 99% of the time or 100% of the time. And then noticing when they're moving, when they're creating coalitions, and making sure that we're participating in a functional manner. I like to think of us as a low ego organization. I want to go to bed thinking I changed the world. I don't care if anyone knows that I did. I just want good bedtime stories for my own kid, Okay, I think I'm out of time and out of questions. So I turn it back over to you guys. Thank you so much for letting me yammer on for so long.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was awesome. And it's always wonderful to hear that there are, in fact, ways that individuals can initiate something powerful with a corporation that they feel is, when you feel a corporation is so big that you can't impact it. And yet what you're saying is, well, wait a minute, yes, you can. And don't be afraid that they're so big. And so that's a really powerful thing for people to be able to feel that way. So I really appreciate that. And if you had like one takeaway that you would ask, you would recommend that elders could do as a takeaway, what would you say that would be?
It's a good question. I think that there's a lot of value in, especially when you're a group like yours that comes from lots of different places, in coordinating a human response. So a powerful tactic is everyone deciding they're going to write a letter to the editor of their local paper about something. All those letters to the editors and all those small papers, they start to add up and make a difference. And if you choose a topic, it can start to really add up. It's kind of like what a petition provides, this idea of people come together from all over the world or all over a country and work in concert together. So I think you guys, I'm sure you already do this, But this idea of just like you guys being able to talk about what it is that you want to focus on and coming up with one tactic that you all can participate in. And it can be something small. You're all going to write, I don't know, what's a good one in the US right now? You are all going to write Disney and tell them that they should get off Fox News because stop advertising on Fox News because it's sowing climate disinformation, for example. They were going to pay attention, even if it's just a few hundred letters. It's going to make a huge difference. That's a huge number of letters for that department to get. Mm-hmm. We used to do, before Twitter was so popular, we used to do tweets at politicians, and there was always some intern monitoring their Twitter inbox, and then they'd get like 10 tweets, and they would freak out, and then they'd run to the politician's office. And it was just so amazing that you could get the politician's attention from 10 tweets, because they didn't really understand this internet thing yet. But I feel like old-fashioned letter writing to corporate headquarters or personalized emails that echo a similar sentiment have the same effect, where you have some sort of junior staff member who freaks out and decides this is really important for the vice president of communications to take a look at. And next thing you know, you're in the C-suite discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great to know. And I think we try and do letter writing campaigns, and we can certainly do more. We haven't done a lot of it in terms of corporations, although recently we partnered with Stop the Money Pipeline for the Earth Day events, and we would have done better, I think, if we weren't sequestered, but we did a letter writing campaign to Chase and Wells Fargo. So we did participate in those, and I think that there's opportunity for us to do more of that, that, you know, I hadn't really thought a great deal about, because I think in terms of policy and legislation rather than impacting it from the other end at the corporate level. So yeah, we could certainly do more of that moving forward. Let me just look in the chat and make sure there's no more questions. Just lots of kudos there for your presentation. It was really well received, and I would like to thank you so much for spending time with us, and I hope that we can maybe engage with you somehow in the future and participate in a campaign. I think that would be wonderful. And I would like to just remind everybody our next national call is on July 28th. And that day we will have Steve Simon from Elders Climate Action with Reverend Michael Malcolm, who you may remember from about a year ago, and David Arkush talking about the vision for equitable climate action, which is a document, a blueprint vision really for just transition and equitable transition for everything related to climate and living on the planet. So it's going to be, it's a big document. It's really it's a little different than the Green New Deal, but it's similar concept in that it's a vision. So I invite you all to join with us on July 28th. Is that the date? Yeah, July 28th. And thank you again, Emma, and thank you, Myra, for being here. This has been great. And I leave you all with have a great evening and a great rest of your week. So thank you all.
Thank you, Emma.